Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first official session of our Youth Diplomacy and Development course. I am Anthea Atkinson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm assuming most of you should be in the WhatsApp chat by now. I'm one of the steering committee members for the Given Caribbean chapter. So feel free to put on your cameras, but for now, we'd appreciate if you would keep your mics muted. There will be parts of the session where you can interact with our presenter, but please, as I said, be mindful of other colleagues and even the time of your presenter. So let's keep our mics muted and be respectful to everyone, guys. So let me apologize for our first session, our orientation session. We did send an email to you guys stating that, we had a few little things that we needed to sort out. So we've got everything on the ball now. So we're all ready and good to go. Now, our presenter today, we've got a great session planned for you guys to get the ball rolling and start things off. We have the amazing Dr. Yard, who is the Ecosystem and Biodiversity Program Manager of Canary. And Canary, for those of you who may not know, is the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. So before working for Canary, Dr. Yard actually held some key positions at Conservation International. She worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the CARICOM Secretariat, and she even worked as an independent consultant for government agencies across the Caribbean, regional and international organizations, and the key theme for tonight, civil society groups. Dr. Yard holds a PhD in geography, a Master of Science in Environmental Technology, and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering. So she brings not only experience, but a wealth of knowledge she's going to share with you guys today. So please give her your full attention. Like I said at the start of the session, there will be opportunities for you guys to interact, but please do not unmute unless prompted to unmute. Be respectful of your colleagues, your presenters, so everyone in the session here. So Dr. Yard, the floor is yours. They're all yours tonight.
Thank you so much, Anthea. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. And I just like you, Anthea, to confirm that you're seeing it when I share. Can you see? Just give me a nod or a thumbs up if you're
Yes,
seeing.
it's
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thumbs up in the chat. Perfect. So, good afternoon to or evening to everyone who has joined this session. It is really an honor and a privilege for me to have been asked to make this presentation to you as participants in the inaugural GYBN Caribbean Youth Diplomacy Development course. I'd like to thank GYBN Caribbean very, very much for the invitation. And to add to Antia's introduction, I would like to mention that I have myself been an environmental negotiator for the government of Barbados, primarily in the sphere of chemicals and waste management, not in the biodiversity sphere, but I have supported Caribbean negotiators and SIDS negotiators in negotiations on the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Agreement on Marine Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, also known as the BBNJ Agreement or the High Seas Treaty. And as Andy has mentioned, I currently work with Canary, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. So I'll start my presentation to give an overview of what I'll be talking to you about this evening. I'm going to start with the presentation with the introduction to Canary, which is one of the leading Caribbean civil society organizations working in the field of natural resources management. Then I'll talk a bit about what CSOs are and what the Caribbean CSO landscape looks like these days. I'll provide a few examples of how Caribbean CSOs, civil society organizations, are delivering biodiversity impact and therefore directly contributing to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the achievement of global biodiversity goals. And then I'll move on to explore the kinds of contributions that CSOs and particularly Caribbean CSOs can make to global biodiversity governance through the negotiations process. I'll share some learning resources in the form of recommended reading, and then we should have some time for questions and answers. But first, before I get into the meat of the presentation, just some quick notes on why this all matters. The main reason it's important is that Caribbean governments, and indeed no governments in the world, can deliver on national or international biodiversity ambitions alone. This is why the conventional biological diversity has advanced from what they call whole of government approaches to whole of society approaches. In these approaches, all sectors, the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector are essential. Oops, let's go back up. Are essential partners for biodiversity progress. And of course, local action by CSOs and other stakeholders contribute significantly to global biodiversity outcomes and global biodiversity progress. So, CSOs in the Caribbean and elsewhere are key biodiversity actors. As promised, an introduction to Canary, which is the CSO that I work with. The Caribbean Natural Resources Institute is a, an independent technical institute that focuses on for promoting and facilitating stakeholder participation in the stewardship of natural resources in the Caribbean. Canary has been around for more than 30 years, and for over 30 years, it has been dedicated to ensuring that Caribbean people who rely on natural resources for their livelihoods and for their well-being have an active role to play and have something to say about how those natural resources are managed. Canary's vision, and let me make sure that I get this right, is a vision of empowered Caribbean people who have the information, the capacity, and the interregional and global linkages needed to transform Caribbean and global systems and institutions, and Caribbean people who are working together to deliver equity, well-being, and resilience throughout the region. And our mission, which you see on screen, is informed by this vision. Canary operates primarily in four programmatic areas. These are biodiversity and ecosystems, which is the program that I lead, climate resilience, equity and justice, and participatory governance. And innovation is a cross-cutting theme across all of Canary's programs. We operate primarily in five flagship areas, and those are local ecosystem stewardship, that's number one, nature-based solutions, local green-blue enterprises, climate justice, and empowered civil society. Canary is headquartered in Trinidad, but we are implementing activities all over the Caribbean, and we have staff as well all over the region in Trinidad and Tobago, in Jamaica, in the Dominican Republic, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, and in Barbados, where I am based. So after that introduction to a specific Caribbean CSO, and before I get into CSO's general involvement in biodiversity management and governance, let's define our terms. What exactly are civil society organizations? There are several definitions of civil society organizations floating around out there. And the one I've chosen for this presentation comes from UNESCO. And it is that civil society organizations are non-governmental entities that operate independently to promote social, cultural, and humanitarian goals. What this definition omits, but what is generally understood, is that CSOs are usually also not-for-profit entities. UNESCO goes on to say, to explain that civil society organizations play a crucial role in advocating for community interest, in fostering civic engagement, and in addressing societal issues. And CSOs encompass a diverse range of groups, including charities, advocacy networks, and grassroots movements. So basically, a CSO, civil society organizations, is a broad term for non-governmental, not-for-profit groups that have been formed by citizens to promote public interests. Okay, great. So a question for you, and I'd like you to type your answers in the chat, which I think I will be able to keep an eye on. Um, Concisely, what is the difference between a CSO and an NGO, if there is a difference? I'll give you some time to get into the chat and provide your thoughts and answers. I see that some of you are raising hands. I would prefer if you type your answers into the chat if you can. Let's see. Let me see if I can see those. Great. So they're coming up in the question and answer session. So I'm seeing an NGO can be a CSO organization, but not otherwise. And I'm sorry, my apologies. Can you put your answers in the Q&A box, not the chat? The chat, I understand, has been disabled. NGOs are a subset of CSOs. Any other thoughts or reflections coming through? I don't see. Oh, they're coming. Here they are. Here they are. Here they are. So an NGO can be a CSO, but not otherwise. They work towards different goals and missions. And we have definitions here, a broad term for all government nonprofit groups, and the type of CSO that is usually more structured and works on development, advocacy, or humanitarian issues. Great. So I think most of you have NGOs can be CSOs, but CSOs cannot be NGOs. Great. So most of you are well, all of you really are on the ball in that all NGOs are CSOs, but not all CSOs are NGOs. NGOs are indeed a specific kind of CSO. So CSOs generally include all organizations that exist outside of government and outside of the private sector that are formed by citizens to pursue shared interests or shared goals. An NGO, on the other hand, is a specific type of CSO that typically works on broad public interest issues or causes. So those may be human rights, development, humanitarian aid, or environment. Some CSOs are not NGOs, are not considered NGOs because they primarily represent not broader issues, but the specific interests of their members, the specific shared interests of their members. And Some examples of these are workers' unions, professional associations, like an Association of Professional Engineers or an Institute of Architects, and producers' associations. These are organizations that focus on member representation and representing members' interests rather than advocacy and action on broad societal issues. So those would be classed as CSOs, but not as NGOs. That's the distinction. NGOs are a subset of the overall class of CSOs. With that clarified, let's go to and I will correct myself, it's not the chat, it's the Q&A box. And I'd like you to type in each of you to type in the name of one CSO that you know working on biodiversity in the Caribbean and where they work. And give some time for that, and I'll look at the responses. Great. So we're seeing GYBN, of course, the Belize Audubon Society in Belize, Nature Seekers in Trinidad, Canary, yes, thank you. The Cayman Islands National Trust, Green Heritage Fund Suriname, Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, Caribbean Environmental Solutions in Dominica, Canary. And I'm not going to get this pronunciation right, Yache Conservation Trust working in Southern Belize, the Barbados Sea Turtle Project, and I see a familiar name. Hi, Jason. The South Rupununi Conservation Society in Guyana, the Caribbean Ocean Trust, Save the Bays in the Bahamas, Wildlife and People Suriname. This is fantastic. Um, these are some really great examples of biodiversity-focused CSOs working across the Caribbean, um, several of which I myself was not familiar with. So thank you for sharing that new knowledge with me. I did see a mention of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. And so I wanted to add a bit of clarification around that. Organizations like UNEP, UNDP, the FAO, etc., are not considered civil society organizations. They are considered intergovernmental organizations in that they have not been formed by citizens or members of society. They have been formed as intergovernmental organizations by governments. So if they've been formed by representatives of the public sector, essentially. So you have internet governments, IGOs are intergovernmental organizations, CSOs, and as a subset of CSOs, NGOs, and UNEP and organizations of the bodies of the United Nations, the OECS Commission as well, CARICOM and the CARICOM Secretariat would be considered intergovernmental organizations rather than civil society organizations. Um, On this slide, I've shared just a very small sample of some of the Caribbean CSOs that immediately came to mind when I asked myself that question around what CSOs that I know that are operating in the Caribbean. And this is really a small sample because there are numerous CSOs operating in the Caribbean CSO landscape. It's a landscape that is wide and is very diverse. So I'm going to provide some information about the Caribbean CSO landscape. And the information is taken from an ecosystem profile that was prepared specifically for the Caribbean Islands Biodiversity Hotspot as part of the work of the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, or CEPF. The profile was prepared by Canary with contributions from international CSOs, including BirdLife International, IUCN, and the New York Botanical Garden. I will give the proviso that the information here is a little bit dated. The ecosystem profile was prepared in 2019, but it is the most recent overall survey that we have available. So, speaking about the breadth and diversity of the Caribbean CSO landscape, the survey in 1999, a rapid survey, revealed that there are over 350 CSOs, 379 to be precise, working in the Caribbean islands on conservation and environmental issues. I must acknowledge that 379 is probably actually an undercount because the survey was focused on the Caribbean islands hotspot. And so it only took into account the 11 Caribbean island countries that are eligible for CEPF funding. So it does not include the dozens and possibly hundreds of additional environment and conservation related CSOs that are working, for example, in Belize, in Guyana, in Suriname, and in the French and UK overseas territories. And I should also say that not all of the 379 that were counted were Caribbean CSOs. Some of them were international or global CSOs that are working in the Caribbean, but were not formed in the Caribbean. So looking at the distribution of these CSOs across the Caribbean islands hotspot, um, as you might expect, the distribution of the number of CSOs generally is aligned with size and population of Caribbean countries. So the largest number of CSOs was in the Dominican Republic with 74. The second largest was in Jamaica with 67. And then you have sort of decreasing numbers. The majority of countries had um, a number of CSOs in like the teens or 20s. And the smallest number at the time of the survey was in St. Vincent of the and the Grenadines with 10 CSO organizations working specifically on environment and biodiversity issues. The Canary team asked environmental CSOs in the Caribbean to fill out a questionnaire looking at sort of their capacity, their financing, their staffing, their areas of operation, and their capacity needs and challenges. Um, the majority of respondents to this questionnaire were national and regional NGOs. And of these, over 70% were operating with a staff complement of fewer than 15 people. More than half were operating with a budget of less than 200,000 US dollars per year. The organizations that reported indicated that they received funding from a number of sources, including international NGOs, and those would be organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, WWF. They receive funding also from philanthropic foundations, from bilateral donors, which are sort of other governments that are giving development aid, from multilateral donors, such as the World Bank. And some organizations also receive financing through membership fees and through endowment funds. CSOs were also asked to identify some of their capacity needs and challenges. And two of the primary categories were organizational capacity and technical capacity, but there is also the issue of financial capacity. I want us to keep in mind that a deficiency in organizational or technical capacity does not necessarily mean that the people in the organization are unskilled. It usually doesn't mean that the people in the organization are unskilled. What it can mean often is that there's simply not enough people in the organization to start with. As you would have seen, as I would have told you, uh, 70% of organizations are operating with a staff of fewer than 15 people. And some CSOs are not able to consistently maintain a full staff complement. Some smaller groups that rely on intermittent grant funding actually essentially go dormant, completely dormant between grant cycles. Additionally, grants often come with restrictions on how much they will contribute to operational costs and overheads. So Caribbean CSOs often face challenges in covering what are called their core costs. So things like salaries, rent, internet, legal fees, accounting services, um, training, and time for strategic planning. For any CSO, whether in the Caribbean or anywhere else in the world, the magical words when it comes to financial resources and funding is our unrestricted funding, or money that is made available to support the CSO without restrictions on what it can be used for, within reason, of course. Now, despite civil society capacity constraints and financial constraints, CSOs in the Caribbean play a major, major, major role in delivering conservation impact. In a number of countries, including the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, St. Lucia, and the Cayman Islands, civil society organizations manage really essential protected areas and key biodiversity areas. So in the Bahamas, for example, the Bahamas National Trust manages a national park system that covers over 800,000 hectares of land and sea. The Jamaica Conservation and Development Trust manages the entirety of the Blue and John Crow Mountains World Heritage Site and National Park. So CSOs in the Caribbean have major responsibilities for sustainable management of biodiversity. As the regional implementation team for the Critical Ecosystems Partnership Fund in the Caribbean islands, Canary has been responsible for coordinating support, both financial support and organizational support, to CSOs across the Caribbean that are working in conservation. The CPF through Canary has granted over 10 million US dollars in grants to more than 65 organizations that do work to improve the management of terrestrial key biodiversity areas and enhance civil society capacity. So I would like to highlight some of that work and how it has contributed directly to progress towards targets in the Global Plan for Biodiversity. And in doing so, I would like to acknowledge and thank my colleague at Canary, Nicole Brown, who leads Canary's regional implementing team for the CPF and who very kindly compiled and prepared these examples for me to share. So the first example is from Grenada, from Jamaica, I'm sorry. And in Jamaica, the Sawyers Local Forest Management Community Benevolent Society, that's what LFMCBS stands for, has engaged in a full suite of restoration activities and livelihood activities in Jamaica's cockpit country. And those activities have included reforestation, agroforestry, apiculture training, and beekeeping and rainwater harvesting. By reducing the community's reliance on forest resources, while also improving food security and incomes, the Sawyers Group has lowered deforestation pressures and supported ecosystem recovery. Their work contributes to several of the global biodiversity targets. Here I've highlighted Target 2, which focuses on the restoration of degraded ecosystems. And the work of the Sawyers Group is a model for how community-led, livelihoods-based initiatives can contribute both to ecosystem restoration and to long-term resilience. The next example from Antigua and Barbuda focuses on the Antiguan racer. As many of you may know, The Antiguan racer was once a strong contender for the world's rarest snake, but it has been brought back from the brink of extinction through the efforts of civil society organizations, especially including the Environmental Awareness Group, or EAG, in Antigua. The EAG continues to play a leading role in Antigua racer conservation, and with CEPF support, the EAG is exploring and developing opportunities to expand the racer's range beyond the offshore islands where it now dwells through development of a mainland arc site for the Antiguan racer snake. In doing so, they have been learning as well from the experience of partners in Anguilla, um, which makes their work an example of South-South capacity building under Target 20, as well as contributing to Target 4 on halting species extinction. I do see a raised hand, and I do want to try to keep this a little bit interactive despite the fact that's in the webinar format. So I don't know if Antia or Martin, if you'd be able to open your mic if you have a comment or question. Not sure if mics are opened, can be opened.
I'm not seeing the raised hand in the participants, Dr. Yard.
Okay.
Is it still showing on your end? Because it's who
No,
was the
it's not.
participant?
It's not showing on my end.
Okay,
But
maybe.
I'll keep moving.
Oh,
But also feel free to drop comments or inputs in the question and answer as well. So I'll move on to my next example. And that one is from the Dominican Republic. And I noticed that somebody had put in the Q&A that the focus was mainly on the islands and on the English-speaking Caribbean islands. The focus on the islands in terms of these examples in particular is, as I mentioned, because the CPF work that Canary supports is specifically for the Caribbean islands hotspot, but it is not only for English-speaking Caribbean islands. There is also CPF work in the or has been CPF work in the Mesoamerica hotspot, which includes Belize, and I believe there's also an Amazonia hotspot, which includes Guyana and Suriname. But we at Canary are less familiar with that work because it's not directly within our sphere of action. So an example from the Dominican Republic, and let me make sure that I get the pronunciation of this scientific name right. It is Lucena leucocephala. In Barbados, it's commonly known as river tamarin. It may have common names in your countries and where you're from as well. I'm not going to say the scientific name again. I'm going to continue to call it river tamarin because that is easier for me. River tamarin was originally introduced to the Caribbean for agricultural use, and it has become invasive widely across the region. It outcompetes native tree species, it degrades ecosystems. So in the Dominican Republic, Fundación CI Atabey has applied an innovative approach that combines direct invasive species control, as called for in GBF Target 6 on controlling and managing invasive species, with community behavior change. Sayata Bay encourages farmers to use the plant as livestock forage, and their key message around that is cut it low, don't let it grow. And by doing so, farmers help to reduce the spread of the river tamarin. They're also, through this method, turning the driver of the evasion, which was agriculture, into part of the solution, while also engaging local communities in long-term ecosystem management in a biosphere reserve. And then my final example is from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, GEMS Environmental Management Services has effectively used participatory climate risk mapping to strengthen both conservation and disaster preparedness. GEMS combined local biodiversity and ecosystem knowledge with GIS tools to assess ecosystem vulnerabilities and build a 30-layer climate risk map. They also, through this participatory work, helped to form a national network of 12 community-based organizations. And this network was critical in St. Vincent in terms of response and recovery after Hurricane Beryl in 2024. Currently, GEMS has received sort of a follow-on grant from CPF, and they're working in a second phase to set up community-based biodiversity monitoring systems and to enhance biodiversity friendly and conservation compatible livelihoods in communities in and around key biodiversity areas in St. Vincent Central Mountain Range. So GEM's work contributes to Target 8, as I've highlighted it here, which focuses on minimizing the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, but it also contributes to Target 21 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is focused on ensuring that knowledge is available and accessible to all in an inclusive way to guide biodiversity action. Those are four examples from across the Caribbean, and I tried to give examples from the places with the most environment-focused CSOs and the place with the smallest number of environment-focused CSOs to show that wherever environmental and conservation CSOs are found in our region, as few as they might be, as small as they might be, they are working to deliver meaningful impact. I've been talking a lot. I need to take a breath and maybe a sip of water. So, to give me a break and to give you an opportunity to kind of process and respond to some of the information, I'd like you to share in the Q&A a quick three-word reaction, 3 words only, please, to what you've heard so far. Any reaction to any part of what you have heard that may have stuck with you, provoked a thought, raised a question. 3-word reaction in the Q&A. Let's see what's coming up. Fun, informative, inspiring. Inspiring is a common theme, and I love that because our CSOs are doing really important and inspiring work, even with limited resources. CSOs are critical. Absolutely, Adrian. CSOs indeed are critical. Data accessibility matters. Yes, yes, that's a key consideration, and one that I'm going to touch on a little bit as well in the next section. Many inspiring projects. It is important. Shots, understanding, contemplating. That's an interesting reaction. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit more in the Q&A later when you'll get a chance to actually speak. Love the collaboration. Enlightening, interesting, engaging. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for those groups of 3 words, for those comments, for those reflections. I find them encouraging as well. I find your thoughts encouraging, inspiring, and motivating also. So let me jump back into it. We are moving into the sort of the last lap of my presentation. And in this section, I'm going to talk a bit about how the work of CSOs in the Caribbean can contribute to and shape biodiversity negotiations global environmental diplomacy and therefore shape global biodiversity governance and environmental governance. Because I'm very conscious that this is a diplomacy training course. And I really want to be able to offer that perspective and some insights in that regard. So you may have noticed or concluded or inferred that the majority of environmental CSOs in the Caribbean, the work that they do tends to be weighted more towards operational activities rather than, say, advocacy, environmental diplomacy, international negotiations, and governance. Caribbean CSOs are largely, not entirely, but largely oriented towards the design and implementation of um, biodiversity conservation activities. So these could be protected areas management, site management, species conservation, sustainable livelihoods, local environmental education. They're very action and activity and implementation oriented. Nonetheless, the operation work of CSOs, even without active advocacy, and there are CSOs that engage in advocacy as well, the operation work of CSOs still contributes meaningfully to biodiversity negotiations, or it can contribute meaningfully to biodiversity negotiations and international diplomacy. And I believe that there are significant opportunities to expand and enhance how the civil society sector in the Caribbean can contribute to environmental negotiation processes, strategies, and positions. The orientation towards implementation can be in itself a path to influence and to advocacy. First of all, there are lots of opportunities for negotiators from the Caribbean to use implementation to inform their negotiations. Practical insights, good practices, lessons learned, case studies from of biodiversity action in the Caribbean and other SIDS regions are often missing in global negotiations. You will see tons of examples and case studies and so on from, let's say, the global north, from the developed, quote unquote, world. But from SID regions in the Caribbean, you will see many fewer examples. Drawing on the implementation experience of CSOs can provide those insights and those learnings in the global sphere. And that can fill major gaps in global negotiation spaces where SIDS experiences and SIDS realities are often missing or overlooked or underconsidered. Additionally, implementing experiences and learnings from CSO implementation can be used to inform national and regional negotiating positions and interventions in COPs, in subsidiary body meetings, in preparatory processes. Having these insights and these practical experiences from the field, having real world examples drawn from actual work on the ground can, if used strategically, strengthen and enliven the credibility and validity and defensibility of Caribbean negotiating stances. Caribbean examples of impact can enhance the legitimacy of our negotiation positions and our negotiation processes, especially if documented in a way that takes them from anecdote to data and information. A second point, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, local impact contributes to global goals. Often, the contribution of Caribbean SIDS to realizing global biodiversity is underestimated or overlooked, perhaps as a matter of scale and size. But CSO activities and impact from the conservation of species in Antigua and Barbuda to participatory data and information development into Vincent and the Grenadines to livelihoods focused conservation and ecosystem restoration in Jamaica gives us practice and data-driven insights that negotiators can draw on to illustrate and exemplify progress towards national goals and global goals. And this not only illustrates Caribbean momentum showered towards our shared biodiversity ambitions, but it helps to reduce reliance on sort of generic, broad-based global data sets that is produced at scales that are not relative to our countries. And it counters that by producing regionally grounded concrete knowledge. So that's another way that CSO work and the impact that it has can contribute to negotiations and to global biodiversity diplomacy. The third element is that there is value in and of itself in including civil society perspectives. Um, the inclusion of civil society voices in preparations for negotiations and actual negotiations gives us the chance to gather and to meaningly consider civil society perspectives, civil society knowledge, and society applied experience that may otherwise be absent, and that I think diminishes our diplomacy and our governance in its absence. Including CSO voices can help to ensure that our negotiating positions reflect the full range of Caribbean realities and including lived community experience and don't just represent sort of top-down government viewpoints or top-down academic or technical viewpoints. CSO engagement in negotiations prep and in negotiation processes can also help negotiators to anticipate and address some of the potential practical implementation consequences or implications of draft negotiations text. And that means that negotiators can then participate more effectively in sort of those small groups, subsidiary bodies, sort of working groups, contact groups, technical groups, ad hoc groups that negotiate the details of any environmental agreement, in this case, the CBD. CSOs can help negotiators to surface and spotlight issues that might otherwise emerge in negotiations as blind spots. And finally, CSO participation in national and regional negotiations and preparatory processes respond to expectations under the CBD and under other multilateral environmental agreements for inclusive non-state engagement. And so, including CSO voices, CSO perspectives, CSO information helps the region to stay aligned with emerging global norms on rights-based environmental governance, on equity, and on inclusive governance. Intentional and meaningful inclusion of civil society voices aligns closely with CBD expectations for inclusive participation in implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and inclusive participation in national and international biodiversity governance. And the level of inclusive participation is increasingly scrutinized and is increasingly considered as a key aspect of effective biodiversity management and biodiversity governance. It is not just an add-on. So CSO participation keeps us in line, pardon me, keeps us in line with global norms, but it also better enables our negotiators to speak confidently on inclusion and equity related targets and to speak confidently in discussions related to equity and inclusion. Being able to draw on and share civil society perspectives enhances the authenticity and the legitimacy of negotiators' positions. This slide is just here to remind me to pause, to take a breath, to take a sip of water as I draw to a close. And as I do that, I would like to hand over to you again in the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A box for a little reflection exercise called What I Learned, What I Wonder. So here are your instructions. Please type in the chat briefly, all in the same post, if not in the Q&A box, briefly, all in the same post. One thing you learned and one thing you wonder and plan or intend to explore further after this session or after the course. So one thing you learned and one thing you wonder and intend to learn more about. And while you do that, I'm going to open up the Q&A and I'm also going to take a sip of my tea to soothe my throat. So let's see what you learned and what you wonder. Someone learned, Terry Ann learned the difference between NGOs and CSOs. One thing learned the difference between NGOs and CSOs. Okay, I'm glad that was useful. And one thing to explore further, CSOs working on biodiversity efforts here in Trinidad and Tobago. Incredible. I love that. A wide range of CSOs operating in the region and to explore the work of Canary and how it can relate to your current job. A whole of society approach is key. The sheer amount of, one thing I learned, the sheer amount of organizations working across the region to make a positive impact in the environmental sector, and how wide CSO's impact is. Let me look at a few more. The amount of CSOs active in the Caribbean. Caribbean CSOs are not just supporting biodiversity efforts, they're actually leading implementation on the ground, often with very limited resources. One thing someone wonders, what are the CSOs in Grenada? I can't answer that question for you, but I know a few. I do know of a couple. I can't name them off the top of my head, but there are several out there that are doing important work, and I hope that you do explore that after the session and learn some more about CSO specifically working in environment and biodiversity, that you can engage with and learn more about their work. Okay, I took my sip, I caught myself, and I just want to go back to the session review slide. It says session recap, but it's really just the session overview slide presented again so that I can remind you of what we covered. Talked a little bit about Canary and what it does. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about Canary's work, our website is www.canary.org. We talked a little bit about CSOs, what they are, and the difference between CSOs and NGOs, which was a distinction that several people identified in terms of what they learned. An introduction to, and I should say, a portion of the Caribbean CSO landscape, because there were sort of limitations on the extent of the landscape that were included in the CPF survey, as many people said, there are literally hundreds. And I'm quite sure that if we added the CSOs operating in Belize, in Guyana, in Suriname, in Trinidad and Tobago, in the UK overseas territories, in the French departments, in the US overseas territories, and the Dutch Antilles, that number would probably double. So the CSO landscape in the Caribbean really is vast and diverse. I provided some examples, supported by my colleague, of CSOs delivering biodiversity impact. And I spoke a bit about some opportunities for CSOs to contribute to global biodiversity negotiations, diplomacy, and governance. And here are the additional resources, some recommended reading. Um, I'm sure that you'll be getting a copy of this presentation after the session, so you'll be able, these are all links, so you should be able to click on the links and they will take you to the readings. And that brings us to a Q&A session. And with help from Antia and the Gibbon team, I would be happy to take a few questions on mic from participants, let's say for the next maybe 15, 20 minutes. You can raise your hand. I think Antia will be able to open your mic and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Questions, comments, reflections, whatever you would be interested in contributing. Um, Antia, can you help me out? I see Stefan, I think was first with his hand raised. If you can open Stefan's mic.
Yes, Stefan, you can speak.
There you
Hi,
go.
good
Hello.
evening. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Can you hear me fine?
I'm hearing you great. Thank you.
Okay, so I had a question
Mhm,
about the initial stages of forming a CSO
mhm,
because setting it up correctly will allow for maximum reputation and then maximum negotiation abilities. The
mhm,
question is focused on what are some of the best practices in that initial structuring of CSOs that will allow for maximum financial accountability and transparency because you're aiming to reduce the risk of financial malpractice as successive leaders pass through this organization.
mhm. I can't answer that question comprehensively, but I'll do my best to give some thoughts on that. First of all, and this is also addressed in to some extent in the CPF ecosystem profile in their section on civil society. The way that you set up a CSO is to a large extent governed by your country's legal frameworks and requirements governing CSOs or NGOs. And so there will be requirements that you would have to align with, particularly as an NGO. Most countries have NGO requirements and not necessarily CSO requirements. So there are legal provisions around what a structure would take, what financial measures you have to put in place, what kind of governance measures you would have to put in place for NGOs specifically as a subset of CSOs. Um, there is also recognized best practice in relation to governance, operating procedures, financial governance, decision making, reporting, so on and so forth. And there is, I can't give you specific details of guidance for any given CSO, but there is sort of recognized good practice. Um, I will say for CSOs looking to access funding from funding partners, financial governance is prime. You have to be, a CSO has to be able to show that it is able to receive, manage, and account for the funds that it has received from donors and to report on those funds without significant risk of financial malfeasance. And so I would say for CSOs looking to access funding or financing from partners, really, really close attention has to be paid to financial procedures and financial governance. I'm not in a position to give specific recommendations, but there is guidance out there that you can access that would support you on that. And actually, let me make a note. Um, if I have the chance, I'll see if I can share some recommended guidance or best practices with the Gibbon team as part of sort of expanded recommended reading. Thanks, Stefan, for that
Thank
question.
you. Thank you so
Um,
much.
apologies that I wasn't able to answer it fully and in detail. Next person in the queue I see is Nia.
Naya. Yeah. Naya, you
Good
can.
evening. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Good evening, Dr. Yard. I just wanted to ask if there's usually tension between advocacy and collaboration when working with governments.
that's an excellent question. Is it Nia or Naya?
Nia.
That's a great question, Nia.
Thank you.
Um, I will respond frankly and say yes, there can be tension and between advocacy of CSOs and governments. I will also refer you to the CEPF ecosystem profile, not because I've gotten all my information from that. I have my own professional experience from this with this as well, but because there are examples in that profile that document how that tension can manifest.
Hmm.
Um, there are cases where CSOs in the Caribbean, particularly larger ones, particularly those that are charged with um, responsibility for managing protected areas and national parks, for example, receive government subventions. And there have been cases where such CSOs having spoken out in an advocacy stance that is opposed to a government position on, say, a particular policy or development or so on, have coincidentally, maybe, had their subventions reduced in a way that significantly hamstringed their operations. So
Oh,
yes, there can be conflict between CSO's advocacy role and and governments. I think sort of the what is called the I can't remember the correct phrase, but the operational space for CSOs in the Caribbean is relatively wide compared to other parts of the world. And I think the perspective, sort of that oppositional positioning of CSOs and government is declining substantially as governments in the Caribbean and globally move towards a greater recognition of the importance of inclusivity and whole of society approaches. But there is that potential for conflict between advocacy, CSO's advocacy role, and government's positions and policies.
thank you
Thank
so much.
you. A good question. Next is, and I think I'll be able to take maybe um, three or four more questions. Sorry, I won't be able to answer everyone. So that takes me down on my queue to Ania Lewis. Um, and the next person in the queue is Lavia Joseph. Lavia,
Good
your mic should be
evening.
open.
Yes, it's actually Lavinia, sorry.
Lavinia. Okay.
Yes.
Hi, Lavinia.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation today. It was very informative and I learned quite a lot, quite a number of things I didn't really know, and it was very informative. So thank you very much. So my question in reference to the CSO, I would like to know if there are any collaborations between academia research and CSOs to help to drive policy. And if not, what are some of the steps that could be taken to enforce this sort of collaboration?
Great question, Lavinia. And there absolutely are collaborations between academia in the Caribbean and academia outside the Caribbean and Caribbean CSOs. Um, CSOs have partnered with, in some in some spheres or by some definitions, academic institutions that are not government run, because a government run university, for example, or a government run institute is not independent. And the thing about CSOs is that they are independent of government and the public sector. But by some definitions, independent academic institutions, independent universities are actually considered part of civil society. And so, for example, under the CEPF program, a number of universities, University of the West Indies and a couple of universities in the Dominican Republic were able to access CSO funding. In addition to that, there have been partnerships between universities and CSO organizations in implementing projects, um, into developing data gathering systems, collaborations by which universities share information and data with CSOs, develop information sharing platforms for access by CSOs, support CSOs with capacity building, all sorts of collaboration. So there is absolutely strong relationships between academia and CSOs in the Caribbean. And yeah, it has really delivered sort of and strengthened, I think, both parties in terms of their ability to deliver on biodiversity outcomes and biodiversity goals. Thanks, Lavinia. Next up on my list is Hannah. Hi, Hannah.
Hi, good night. Can you hear me clearly?
Hearing you loud and clear.
Okay, so my question is considering regional diversity in the Caribbean, how do CSOs adapt their strategies to local cultural and economic context while maintaining measurable impact?
That's a great question. So, how do CSOs adapt? I would actually say that CSOs don't have to adapt their strategies to local context because a lot of the drive and motivation, a lot of the CSOs are local or national organizations. And so they were formed specifically to respond to local social, environmental, and what was the other one? Cultural context. Um, In fact, a lot of CSOs in the Caribbean are local, as in very local, community-based organizations that are working in their specific village, their specific community, or sort of uh, have connected specific communities to deliver very, very local interventions and actions and impact. Um, if I might kind of switch the question, I think the bigger question, or not the bigger question, but the flip, the counter of that question is, given the wide landscape of local and national CSOs in the Caribbean that are working in their own particular contexts, what opportunities are there for these entities to come together to express um, to develop broader regional voices, to share broader regional perspectives, and to sort of um, engage in CSO action, regional civil society action, in addition to national and local civil society action? I think that is actually perhaps the more challenging question. I know that Canary in the area of climate resilience, climate justice, has been working to bring together collaboratives of civil society organizations from around the Caribbean in that space. They've been doing that as well in relation to implementation of the Escazú Agreement, but there is still so much to be done. I don't have the answer for the best ways to do it, but I think that is the space where there's a real need and where there's a real scope for opportunity and growth and development. Thanks, Hannah. I don't know if that answers, well, I think it answers your questions, but perhaps adds little additional perspective as well. Um,
Thank you very much. It does.
okay,
It
great.
does.
Thank you. And next up, there's so many questions. There's so many hands in the queue. I'm so sorry, everyone. I cannot uh, answer you all, but I will take, as I promised, two more. The next one up is Tamoy. As always, please correct me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. And then the last question will be from Anya or Ania.
Well, Dr. Yard, you pronounced it correctly. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think I echo the sentiments of all the others who would have shared same. And my question is very brief. You work within this space, and I can imagine that you work in a context where you have to either negotiate or amplify the voices of the interest groups or whatever issue it is that you're speaking about. How do you think, or can you speak to how it is that CSOs are able to effectively amplify their messages without being so subsumed on a global stage? I hope it wasn't too convoluted, but I know we're small islands. So how do we strategically and pragmatically, I think, share our voices and the views that affect the region when we're in a global space and not necessarily be subsumed by the other major players? That's the question.
That is a great question, Tamoy. Several things are coming to mind. Um, One thing that I think is essential and very pragmatic is really the issue of access to global negotiations by CSOs and Caribbean CSOs. And this is not access and participation. And this is not just a challenge for CSOs, it can also be and has been a challenge for government negotiators in that it costs money to go to global negotiations. It costs money to travel. It costs money to be in the meetings. And in addition to the COPs themselves, as you may know, there are a number of sort of lead up negotiations and discussions in subsidiary bodies that where the real meat of the decisions and the draft text are formed. So you may have a COP every year, as is in the case for climate, or every 2 years, this is the case for biodiversity. But in between those COPs, there is a long round of meetings and negotiations and subsidiary body meetings that are going on, and it costs money to attend those things. And Caribbean participants, whether government or civil society, often don't have the resources to be able to participate in the full spectrum of negotiations. That is a practical challenge, and I think it is a challenge that unfortunately the region will be encountering more and more as sort of the global geopolitical landscape changes and funding is diverted away from development aid, from environmental issues, from sustainable development towards global security concerns. So that's the one big answer. The second answer is that I think for Caribbean CSOs, I mean, Caribbean countries going to negotiations, our countries are small. For CSOs, it's even more difficult because CSOs are even smaller. But I think there is the opportunity to adapt the strategies that have been used by Caribbean governments in approaching negotiations, which is creating opportunities to come together, and this is CSOs I'm speaking to specifically, to come together to examine in advance negotiation documents, to perhaps select a few priority issues that are particularly relevant to your interests, to your activities, to your work, and to do what you can to formulate strong and consistent positions on those that you can express if you have the good fortune to be able to be present in a negotiation, that you can give, for example, to a representative of GYBN or a representative of civil society that will be at the negotiations, and also that you can present to your governments so that they can take them into consideration at negotiations. And this again speaks to the advocacy role of CSOs. Advocacy is not easy. I will be quite frank, advocacy is not easy. It takes a lot of coordination, it takes a lot of preparation, and you have to be quite frank, prepared for your voices to perhaps be overlooked or underestimated, but you have to be persistent and to keep striving. You will find that the CSOs that have made the greatest impact, both in implementation and in advocacy, are in the Caribbean, are those that kept on fighting the good fight. So persistence is key. Persistence and striving is key. Um, I hope that answered your question, Tamoy, a little bit. And okay, and last question, unfortunately, is it Anya? Anya?
That is correct, Dr.
Anya.
Yard. It is
Okay,
Anya.
great.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come and present and kick off our course really strong. So, my question for you is, you highlighted that CSOs thrive on unrestricted funding. Like that's really the golden opportunity that they're looking for. In my experience, right now, I work in the consultant space on sustainable development and biodiversity finance projects. And I see that the funding, it's heavily earmarked, it's heavily tracked, a lots of reporting requirements. So my question is, besides philanthropy, how are our regional CSOs able to access that golden unrestricted funding for their operations?
That is an incredible question. I am afraid that I may not have a good answer. And I want to say I came to Canary. Before I was with Canary, I worked with Conservation International, which is a global NGO, uh, like 2,000 staff, operations all over the world. And they also struggle to secure unrestricted funding. So it's not a Caribbean CSO problem. Even the biggest CSOs struggle with this. Um, I don't have, I'll be frank with you, I don't have a good answer. I think if there was sort of a magic bullet for it, sort of every CSO we would be pursuing a specific strategy. Um, I will say unrestricted funding is more likely to come from philanthropic organizations than from, say, bilateral or multilateral funding. And what can sometimes be helpful is to target organizations, philanthropic trusts or funds that may not actually have a specific focus on conservation and biodiversity, that are more interested in supporting civil society participation, that are interested in supporting good governance, that are interested in supporting development more generally. In my experience, looking outside of the environment and conservation and biodiversity stream opens up those opportunities for accessing unrestricted funding and unrestricted financing. So looking at at organizations that are interested in governance, in civil society development, in broader development, in participation. Those can be stronger means. Looking at organizations that are interested perhaps in a specific sector, in agriculture, in um, indigenous peoples, local communities, local knowledge. Those sorts of organizations may be able to give you, even if not a fully unrestricted scope, but a broader scope in terms of the financing that they provide. Um, I know I said Annie would be the last person, but I did notice that most of the questions so far have been from women. And in the interest of tip towards gender balance, I'd like to invite Ramon to to ask a question so that we can have a male voice. I'm making an assumption of about Ramon's gender from his name, their name. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, I wanted to. Oh, thank you very much for your presentation, first and foremost. I wanted to know how exactly Canary sees the progress in the achievement of the biodiversity or climate-related SDGs in the Caribbean. Uh, do you think the progress is going well as we head towards 2030?
Um, so is this the biodiversity and climate related SDGs?
Yes.
I will be frank, Ramon. After having given you the space to answer the question, I cannot answer that question fully because I believe that answering those kinds of questions really does need to be informed by data and not by speculation. And usually because the SDG progress in general runs to 2030, there's usually sort of evaluation maybe every 5 years or so. And I'm not currently in a position to have been able to compile data or look at data that would enable me to give you sort of like a quick, thorough answer in terms of progress towards the biodiversity and climate related SDGs. I will say that there is regular country reporting on their sustainable development goals, and that is summarized on a number of UN websites. There is also, with some challenges, regular country reporting on the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and in fact, a report on progress towards the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework will be published this year at the Biodiversity COP in Armenia, I believe it is, in October or November of this year. But I do suspect, as is usually the case, that Caribbean progress will be underrepresented in that report. And of course, countries do also report regularly on their national climate goals, particularly as contained in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And that information is also available online and compiled for reporting to the COPs. So I can't answer your question. I don't want to give an opinion because I don't think that's a question of opinion. It is a question that needs to be supported by data, but the data to answer that question is out there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ramon. That was the last question. Unfortunately, I suspect that we're approaching our time limit. It has been really, really great talking to all of you. Thank you so much for your incredible questions. This was a real privilege for me to be able to make this presentation. I was a little bit nervous when Terrell told me last week that it was the first. Um, so I hope that it has set a good foundation, and I'm happy to hand back over to the given team to close, cover any housekeeping and so on that may be required at the end of the session. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure. It's been a joy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yard, and not only for your presentation, but for being so transparent with your responses. As you said, a lot of the questions, they require not just your opinion, but data to support. So thank you so much for your transparency. To our participants, we've noted that, a lot of you guys did not get to speak during the session, but that is okay. We are going to be opening up a Google Classroom soon. Please pay attention to the emails. Look out for those follow-up emails. They will have information about not just the Google Classroom, but on the upcoming course sessions as well. The PowerPoint presentation will be shared with you all, as well as the recording. And we are working towards having a Zoom session outside of the planned presentations where we can have you guys interact more with each other and facilitate open discussions. So, don't feel like, okay, I didn't get to speak at this time. It's totally fine. Thank you so much for attending. And thank you again, Dr. Yard. We look forward to seeing more of you in the future. And even our participants, we look forward to having more engaging sessions with you guys in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.